Some stories are told, others are survived.
Hill 898 in Basilan was no longer a mountain. It had become a fortress of death. The jungle canopy grew so thick here that it strangled the sunlight, leaving the slopes in a permanent, humid gloom. Deep within the tangled roots and dense undergrowth, the enemy had constructed a network of reinforced bunkers. These positions were not merely dugouts, they were engineered kill zones. Every approach to the peak was covered by interlocking fields of fire. A fighter could sit behind a wall of earth and heavy logs, watching the base of the slope through a narrow firing slit. Entirely unseen from the path below, there was no way to advance that did not cross a line of sight. The air here carried the heavy, metallic scent of stagnant water and old grease. Birds did not cow. Insects fell silent. The entire mountain seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first sign of movement. The Abu Sayyaf fighters held the high ground, and they had turned the natural topography into a lethal trap. Every meter of the ascent was a gamble against an unseen barrel. This was not a battlefield, it was a grinder. The order arrived at dawn. Take the peak, clear the bunkers, no room for error. The scout rangers moved out in a tight column, boots hitting the soft, rain-soaked earth with rhythmic thuds. They left the relative safety of the perimeter and stepped into the wall of green. The incline hit them immediately. It was not a path, it was a vertical scramble through twisted vines and slick, rotting foliage. Every step required a conscious effort to find purchase on the shifting mud. They kept their spacing, eyes scanning the canopy, fingers hovering near triggers. The humidity surged, thick enough to taste, coating their skin in a layer of sweat that refused to evaporate. They moved deeper into the shadows of the lower slope, pushing through branches that snapped back like whips. The silence of the mountain was absolute, an unnatural stillness that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. They knew the enemy was watching from the heights, unseen and waiting. The Rangers kept moving, their breathing steady, their focus narrowed to the next meter of mud and the next stand of trees. The peak loomed above, hidden behind a curtain of fog and foliage. The lead scout halted. He held up a hand, palm flat. The column froze behind him. Then, the silence shattered. It began with the rhythmic mechanical clatter of machine guns opening up from the ridgeline. A sound so loud it seemed to vibrate the very air. Tracers carved bright, lethal paths through the dense canopy above, shredding leaves and branches that rained down like confetti. There was no warning. The enemy fire hit the slope with the force of a hammer. Dirt geysered into the air as rounds tore into the mud, forcing the Rangers to drop instantly. They pressed their chests against the wet, cold ground, trying to shrink into the earth itself. The sound was deafening, a relentless roar that drowned out all human noise. Every time a burst hit the ground, mud sprayed into their faces, coating their skin and clogging their vision. They were pinned. The slope that had been a challenge to climb was now a death trap. There was no cover, only the slight depression of the terrain. The gunfire continued, a steady, pulsing wall of lead that kept them anchored to the mud, unable to lift their heads or return fire. The chaos was absolute when the mountain erupted into a firestorm of smoke and debris. The air filled with the sharp, acrid sting of gunpowder. Every inch of the slope became a target. A ranger to the left tried to crawl toward a fallen log, but a concentrated burst of fire forced him flat, his body jerking as dirt erupted in a line inches from his head. He did not move again. The enemy bunkers remained hidden, camouflaged perfectly against the ridgeline, firing from slits that seemed to vanish into the terrain. Another man attempted to raise his rifle, but a heavy round struck the mud beside him, sending a spray of grit into his eyes. He collapsed, clutching his face, his movements slowing as the reality of their position took hold. More rounds chewed through the roots and ferns, turning the forest floor into a chaotic mess of flying debris. The Rangers were unable to return fire because they could not see the source. Every attempt to shift position resulted in a fresh wave of bullets kicking up stone and soil. The smell of sulfur and wet earth hung heavy in the air, thick enough to taste. Sergeant Herbert Dilag pressed his face into the mud, his lungs burning with each shallow, ragged breath. Beside him, the silence of his men spoke louder than the gunfire. They were frozen, their eyes locked on the ridgeline, limbs heavy with the weight of impending death. A stray bullet shattered a branch just inches above them, raining splinters onto his shoulders, but he did not flinch. And staying meant being picked off until no one remained. He saw the hesitation in the eyes of the man to his left, a flicker of surrender that mirrored his own mounting realization. If they stayed here, the mountain would be their tomb. He forced his hand to grip the grip of his rifle, his knuckles turning white against the grime. Dlog felt the cold mud seep through his skin, a stark reminder of the reality they faced. The chaos around him began to blur, sharpening his focus into a single, narrow point. He realized that the only way to survive was to break the cycle of fear. He shifted his weight, testing his footing in the slit clay, and braced his body for the movement that would demand everything. The decision took root. Herbert Dilag surged upward, his boots tearing into the slick mud. He did not crouch. He did not crawl. He stood to his full height, exposing himself to the entire ridge. The suddenness of his movement ripped through the stalemate. For a heartbeat, the enemy guns stuttered. Caught off guard by the singular target sprinting toward them. Then the ridge exploded. Pumping his legs to close the distance, he was a lone silhouette in the chaos, drawing every ounce of hatred the enemy possessed. The air hummed with the passage of lead. The sound tearing through the trees like a physical force. He felt the wind of a near miss whip past his ribs, but he did not deviate. He kept his eyes locked on the flashes ahead, his heart hammering against his ribs in time with the gunfire. He crossed the open ground in a desperate, lung-bursting sprint. He reached the base of the ridge, the enemy fire hammering the slope where he had just stood, and launched himself toward the first line of defense. Dlog slammed into the reinforced timber wall of the bunker, the impact jarring his entire frame. He did not pause. He kicked the narrow entry flap inward and lunged into the dark, cramped interior. The air inside smelled of stale sweat and cordite. A figure lunged at him from the shadows, but Dlog jammed his barrel into the man's chest and fired. The recoil was violent in the confined space. Two more defenders scrambled to reach their weapons, but the room was too small for them to maneuver. Dilag used the butt of his rifle to strike, his movements sharp and efficient, clearing the space with absolute force. He swept the perimeter, confirming the threat was neutralized, and stepped back into the daylight. He looked down the slope. His unit was still pressed into the mud, watching him with wide eyes. Seeing the bunker silent, the tension in their posture broke. A roar went up from the Rangers as they realized the impossible had happened. The first link in the enemy chain was severed. Dlog did not look back at his men. He steadied his grip and turned his gaze toward the next fortification, the path ahead finally showing a crack in the enemy's iron grip. The slope ahead was a churning mess of wet earth and debris. Dlog stepped out from the clearing and immediately felt the impact of the ridge's defenses shifting toward him. Bullets hissed through the air, vibrating against the trees and spraying mud into his eyes. He wiped his face with a quick swipe of his glove and forced his legs to move. His boots slipped on the saturated ground, forcing him to dig his heels in with every stride to maintain momentum. The air was thick with the roar of sustained gunfire, a constant, deafening drone that obscured all other sound. He kept his head low, his body angled against the barrage, moving in short, jagged bursts. Every time he stopped to find footing, the ground around him erupted in geysers of dirt. He was a target in the open, exposed to the full weight of the fortification's firepower. He saw the next bunker 10 meters ahead, nestled behind a cluster of felled timber. He did not look for cover. He looked for the shortest line of attack. He pushed his lungs to their limit, ignoring the burn in his muscles and the snap of lead inches from his skin. He reached the bunker wall, pressed his back against the rough timber, and prepared to strike again. Dlog did not wait for the dust to settle. He forced his way into the second position. The struggle inside brief and violent. With the bunker cleared, the heavy machine gun fire that had pinned the slope finally sputtered and died. The silence was sudden. Then a shout rose from the mud below. It was the signal. The Rangers, galvanized by the sight of the bunkers falling, surged upward in a single, fluid motion. They moved with the desperation of men who had seen the line broken. One, no longer crawling, they sprinted, their boots tearing through the saturated incline. The enemy fighters, stripped of their covering fire, scrambled to reload or flee. They were caught in the open. The Rangers reached the ridge, their rifles spitting fire at point-blank range. There was no room for the defenders to regroup. Every bunker was met with a storm of lead and iron. The resistance crumbled, turning into a frantic scramble for the rear of the mountain. One by one, the positions were taken by force. The iron grip on the hill snapped under the weight of the assault. The Rangers pushed past the shattered timber and concrete, their momentum unstoppable, until the final corner of the fortress was cleared. The final echo of a rifle shot died against the canopy, and then the mountain simply stopped breathing. The roar of the engagement vanished, leaving behind only the sound of ragged, wet gasps. Dlog stood in the center of the ridge, his chest heaving. He did not drop his weapon. He scanned the perimeter, listening to the drip of water from the trees. Around him, the other Rangers slumped where they stood. Some sat in the churned mud, their hands trembling as they checked their magazines. Others lay back against the shattered timber of the bunkers, eyes fixed on the gray sky. No one spoke. The silence was too heavy to break. They stared down the slope they had just climbed, a path marked by craters, broken branches, and the deep, dark scars of the fight. Every meter of that ascent had been paid for in blood and grit. They remained there in the stillness, surrounded by the remnants of the fortress, anchored to the ground by the weight of what they had survived. The mountain was silent. The objective was secured, and the reality of the cost began to settle over the slope like the thick, humid mist of the jungle.